All right, well, we are back, and I hope everyone had a time to stretch and digest and settle for another really powerful session. I'm very, very, very humbled to welcome you to session 2, which is New Directions. My name is Christina, and I'm humbly one of the co-directors of the Region 10 or Northwest MHTTC, and I'm very honored to be with our speakers today, Erin, Erica, Noni, and Lise. The theme for this session includes how our speakers are expanding the grief and bereavement fields, new ways of understanding grief sensitivity, new language, and invitations for the traditional fields expansion. They will also share what they have learned and are learning from COVID-19 and pan/syndemic grief sensitivity. For their full bios, check the full program and our GSVLI CV to reference their work. Pardon me, here we go. Many of you are here today, and to me, that indicates, we have so much, we're trying to keep going. Really, this demonstrates the need for us to keep talking about this topic. And this was important before COVID hit our lives. And most of us have had many other difficult things happen to us, our family, those we care about, in addition to COVID's burden and loss of life. Add to that the damage done to our climate, weighing on us, adding to our grief. And most of us aren't really trained in this topic, or if we are, real life teaches us how little we know. So I've really appreciated the discussion so far in the first session. I saw a guest essay today by Dr. Sunita Puri titled, we must learn to look at grief even when we want to run away. And it was very powerful. And I just wanted to share a couple of these quotes. Before us is an opportunity to examine rather than bury the loss and grief around us. And another was, it wasn't my job to protect people from their grief or to solve it. I have learned to look when I wanted to look away. And the prelude to compassion is the willingness to see. So this is not an easy journey, and it doesn't go away, but we are on the journey together. And I'm so grateful to each and every one of you today, and our speakers and our colleagues and our friends. So some housekeeping items for those of you just joining us. Please share resources, thoughts, ideas that resonate with you in the chat box, and choose everyone if it is for everyone. We welcome you to share what's resonating, connected ideas to the discussion, but please not anything that would evoke harm or is not productive. Please share specific comments to panelists if you want to share to hosts and panelists in the drop-down option. And we also welcome your questions through the Q&A box. You can also directly ask for tech help at any point today. All of these sessions are recorded and will be on our event page 2 weeks after the event. And lastly, you can access closed captioning by clicking the CC button. You will receive an email on how to access a certificate of attendance. You must attend at least half of today's events to receive that. And on that note, I think we can go and meet our speakers. Great, thank you. So we'll go alphabetically, and we're going to be asking, we'll start with Erica, then Erin, then Lise, then Noni. We ask you to share at most 10 minutes each answering these same 3 questions. So I won't repeat them, they'll be put in the chat. These are very short questions, short answers, I'm sure. Who are you? What brings you to your grief work? What comes up for you when you hear about our theme for grief sensitivity? Where are we now, and where can we go with our practice? So Erica, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice to be here today, and I was really happy to be invited to this conference. And it's just, interesting to notice we all have, we're in a good company with each other. I'm just happy to be in with like-minded people. We all have a thread with our professional backgrounds and what we study and what we're, the ways in which we're trying to help people. But there's also a shared, human thread in that we all of us here, all of us all over the world experience grief and loss. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Let me share my screen here. And let's see. Okay, everybody see this okay? Great, thank you. Okay, so a little bit about myself, and sorry, I always have a little bit of trouble seeing my own screen when I'm there. All right, well, um, so my name, Erica Srinivasan. I'm an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin in La Crosse. And some of the roles that I have there, I'm co-chair of the gerontology emphasis and also the director for the Center for Death, Grief, and Bereavement. So I do a lot of community work, running death cafes or hosting films, and conversations. And then I also help with running an international conference on death, grief, and bereavement. And in my department, I teach the gerontology courses. So that includes things like adulthood and aging, the death and dying course, and then I'll be teaching a course on dementia. And my research, I've kind of spanned three different areas, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in our time together today. I primarily research grief and aid in dying, so looking at family members' grief following an assisted death. And I've also just started looking at that same question among physicians and their experiences with aid in dying. And then I also study loss, grief, and coping experiences with dementia, but more specifically looking at the subjective experiences. So I'm working with people who have dementia to understand their subjective experiences, mostly with people with young onset dementia. And then I've also been studying COVID-19, as I'm sure a lot of us have, mostly in the young adult population, taking a look at what loss experiences they've had and their coping and post-traumatic growth experiences. And then just me as a person, I also have a bunch of different roles. I'm a parent, a partner, aunt, child, community member, sibling, friend. Kind of appreciate heartful connections, which also, this conference so far is feeling very heartful. So I appreciate that. And then I just enjoy roaming around, hanging out, yoga, reading, travel, sorts of things. So what brought me to my grief work was a series of these different experiences. I was very lucky to have this synchronous or experience of synchronicity. So first I worked at an assisted living facility when I was in the end of high school and in college. And I would repeatedly notice the residents would need to talk about death, either their own impending death or just thoughts generally about death or coping with the death of another resident or a friend or a family member. And repeatedly, it seemed it didn't matter who was responding to them, whether it was an adult child or maybe somebody who worked at the care facility. It was always, don't talk like that, look on the bright side, or you're going to live forever. And this was maybe said to someone with a chronic illness or serious illness or a terminal illness even. And regardless of that, it's just, it was something that someone needed to talk about. Many people needed to talk about, was brought up, and that conversation was just repeatedly minimized. And it really hit me or struck a chord in me. I just felt I was just getting angry of like, why is everybody, shutting these people up? Why are they minimizing the conversation? And these sort of bigger things that have been coming up today of like, death and grief being sort of a taboo topic or being underexplored, despite it being something we all have in common, that we will all experience loss and grief. And I found I was really comfortable listening to people talk about death and loss and grief. So I just became sort of very passionate of wanting to contribute to that field in some way. And around the same time, I was walking in a public library and a book just kind of randomly, fell off the shelf, hit me on the head, like literally hit me on the head, landed on the floor. And I picked it up and was like, oh, it hit me on the head. I should see what this book is. And it was an Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book. And she was talking about, well, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, but she was, talking about the importance of helping people to achieve a quality of life in their life and in their dying process as well. And it just resonated with me so much. My heart started beating really fast the way it does, when something really resonates with me. So it was really nice to have this synchronicity of experiences, and it just got me. It just, confirmed that I wanted to do something in the field of thanatology. So I ended up going to Oregon State University, where I studied human development and family studies and had this more narrow emphasis on gerontology and end-of-life issues. And in that time period, I was studying it academically, and then I also became a hospice volunteer. So I got to have this hospice volunteer for many years. So got to have those really practical experiences with people who were dying and with family members, um, and got to be there at the moment of death, and those sorts of things. And then I experienced my own personal loss experiences, from death and from other losses in life too. And that was very important to experience that angle of things too. So as someone was saying in the last panel, of not just academically understanding these things, but really from within and experientially. So all of those combined kind of brought me to grief work, and I ended up doing my studies. I mentioned I study grief and aid in dying, and I guess from my experiences, and then going to school in Oregon, which is the first state to have made assisted death legal, I was just really curious of like, oh, what does the grief look like from this, and just sort of thinking about my own experiences and imagining, how might that be different, and was really surprised to see that no one had studied that. And it also made me sad to think that probably there needs to be resources specific to grief from this relatively new type of death, and so that's kind of how I decided to focus my work in that area, which I would say kind of fits with this theme of new directions, with it being understudied, or a new area of study, looking at grief with aid in dying. So in terms of this next question, where are we now and where can we go with our practice? I, rather than keeping it specific to my research, sort of decided to talk about this broadly. And I think where we're at now is, finally, happily, we're increasingly acknowledging loss and grief. So we're starting to see more conversations about trauma, about racism, about mental illness. We're seeing proposals for bereavement leave, but still, none of this is as much as it should be, considering we've been experiencing loss and grief since the beginning of time. And I think COVID-19 has absolutely experienced or highlighted loss and grief, and it gave us all a chance to pause and really notice that, and notice, wonderful things about life too, but also really notice the loss and grief and suffering, and highlighting that as something important to focus on. Where can we go with our practice? I think we need to continue studying underrepresented populations and related topics. So, I mentioned with aid in dying, and then also subjective experiences with dementia. Those are two areas where it tends not to be as studied, those populations. Other things to think about: grief from racial trauma, grief in social justice work. We know we really can't show up for others unless we're also simultaneously working, or consistently working with our own grief and understanding that. I think it's really important to understand or acknowledge shadow loss. So I've been seeing this a lot with my students with COVID-19, of that we have so many losses that are in life, that non-death losses, and really important to recognize those and define them as losses. So things like job loss, or friendship loss, or estrangement from parents, all the loss of our assumptive world that we've had, and other concepts, and ambiguous loss, where we maybe don't have closure, or don't have confirmation of a death. Disenfranchised grief, I think, is huge. With probably all of these things I've mentioned, it comes up, and again with COVID-19, a lot of self-disenfranchising grief is another thing I've seen with my students. Of well, this happened, but I know someone else is suffering and more, and so I don't have a right to grieve. And just really recognizing everybody has a right to grieve, and we don't need to create a hierarchy of losses, that loss is loss, and we need to grieve. And acknowledging grieving styles, and that there's not to box things into styles, but I'm just pointing that out as a way to kind of acknowledge that there's a variety of ways to grieve, and a variety of grief reactions. And then the importance of continuing to explore and to create therapeutic coping approaches. So also recognizing there being a variety of ways to grieve, there are a variety of ways to cope too, and a lot of coping tools, and a lot of new new innovative ways of thinking about coping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Just a lot to think about. So we'll hope to get to more of that in our discussion. Rich stuff. Erin, I think you're up next if you're ready to go.
And if I can get myself unmuted, wonderful. Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing those rich experiences. And I'm recognizing how much overlap we have in where we've been and where we're headed. So I am Erin Emery-Tiburcio. I am a geriatric psychologist, and I co-direct the Rush Center for Excellence in Aging at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. I also co-direct our E4 Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Disparities in Aging, and our geriatric workforce enhancement program called Catch On. The bulk of the work that I do these days is in education and in providing education for healthcare providers attempting to meet the needs of older adults. And so I came to that work through starting in graduate school, working in a rehabilitation facility, and recognizing all of the physical losses that people were experiencing and grieving those losses. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but recognizing that I was learning more from older adults than they were getting from me, certainly in my second year of graduate school. What the heck did I know at that point? But recognizing that in older adults, we often fail to acknowledge the wisdom that comes with experience of life. And so I found myself gravitating to that wisdom and gravitating to that life experience, such that my first job out of graduate school was working in palliative care. And I found myself sort of uniquely comfortable in working with people who were dying and their families, much like Erica's experience. And discovering that talking about the end of life and talking about the death is so incredibly taboo in our country, in cultures around the world. And I think Megan talked a little bit about that this morning, and the taboo of even talking about death. And I actually spend a lot of time talking about death and talking about loss and talking about not just loss from death. So COVID has made it crystal clear that we are all grieving. Every single human on this planet is grieving, whether we are grieving the death of someone who we love or we are grieving the loss of what we consider to be normal. We are all grieving. And so one of the things that has become crystal clear to me as we move through this space together is the importance of recognizing that every person we come in contact with is grieving. And how can we create the space for that with everyone? That's a tall order, right? And so one way to think about that is in the different ways that we proceed through that grieving. And so on my slide, the gentleman on my left is my grandfather. In that picture, he was 85 years old, and that was his last speed walking race. And that speed walking race came after years of marathons. He did his last marathon at 75 when he got his pacemaker put in. I was doing research on pacemakers at the time, so I was there for his pacemaker implant. He told the surgeon, "Okay, you've got to set it high enough so that I can win the Vasa ski races this year." To which the surgeon chuckled, and my grandmother and I both looked. Oh, of course, yes, that's critical. And turned out he actually won the 50 and over category that year in his 80s. But what I watched him do is move from marathon runner to skier to biker to slow walker. And as he lost those pieces of function, his sense of self shifted. And those losses then became loss of independence as he and my grandmother moved into an assisted living facility, and loss of that social interaction because he wasn't able to physically get up and move. And also in that same space, moving from walking to walker to cane, and the resilience that came with it. And I think for me, that message of, yes, there is a lot of loss there, and we need to be able to grieve that loss. And also, it's not a shift the sadness aside, it's an and also. To be able to see that resilience. And I think that's the same, the picture at the top there of the gentleman with the lovely headband is my father. And he actually died of COVID a little over a year and a half ago. That picture was taken about a month before he died. And my father was living in an assisted living facility at the time because he had Alzheimer's disease, progressive dementia. And there was a question in the chat earlier about losing people over time, bits of people over time, and that anticipatory grief. So a piece of it is the actual losses. He at sometimes remembered or knew who I was, and at other times he didn't. And that was a loss that I experienced, as do other folks, other families who experience dementia. And also anticipating other losses. So as he started moving through his experience of dementia and my family moving through our experience of dementia, we lost those pieces over time. And then we weren't able to be with him during COVID. And during that time, the care that he received was inadequate. He was given Haldol a lot, way more than should have been. But that was done because they didn't have the staff in-house to be able to effectively manage folks who had behaviors associated with dementia. And so as we think about not only the folks who are experiencing dementia and experiencing losses and the families who are experiencing dementia and experiencing losses, we're also watching nursing home facility staff watch their patients, their residents die. And as we talk about, where do we need to go? We need to recognize all of this loss in the healthcare system. So, particularly in long-term care, those residents are cared for by the same people year after year after year. And my grandfather, the picture of the gentleman on the left, he died a month ago in a facility where he had been cared for the last 5 years. And when he died, I was the one in the room, and staff just kept streaming into the room in tears. And they were trying to console me, and I was recognizing that they also needed to be consoled, and recognizing that we had this shared loss. And in healthcare, as we are watching doctors and nurses deal with death every single day, who may not be as used to dealing with death as they might actually even expect, we really need to be attending to that. And to the families. The third gentleman at the top is one of our volunteers. His name is Raphael. And during COVID, his wife died, and he was not able to be there, and his family was not able to be there. And being of Mexican, they're Mexican immigrants, their family, and their culture was, we are a family, we are together, we are supposed to be there with her. This is unacceptable. And it was excruciating for this family to not be there, as it is for so many families. And to this day, he continues to experience those losses over and over. And it's not going away. And I actually worry for him that he may be developing prolonged grief disorder. Megan mentioned in her comments that we need to not pathologize grief, and I 100% agree. And also, there are folks who need to experience emotions, who need to experience grief, and it is a very normal and human experience. And then there are folks, much like folks who are sad and progress into major depressive disorder, or who are anxious and progress into a generalized anxiety disorder, that there's a level at which folks need intervention in order to just function day to day, that goes beyond a typical grief experience. And so, yes, and in that space. And so the picture on the right is my grandfather and my grandmother celebrating their 75th wedding anniversary. And they had this wonderful party. We were all there. My family was there. Their residents were there. Their co-residents in the facility that they live in were there. It was a fantastic party. They in the facility don't get to have parties now at all. And we also, outside of facilities, are struggling at this point in COVID, even as mask mandates are coming up, and people have different ideas about what's okay, what's safe, what's not safe, but all of us have lost that social interaction. And so again, that recognition that we are all grieving and trying to figure out some sense of normalcy as we do that. And I think that's a big part of the work that I do in grief, is helping people to recognize the loss and I work in a task model of grief generally, the William Worden and Therese Rando version of thinking about grieving. And one of the tasks of grieving is accepting the reality of the loss. That's a really hard thing to do when you don't know what the reality is. Right. And so how do we even make sense of something that we don't understand? And so I'll wrap up with echoing Bob Niemeyer, who is an amazing speaker. And I was so grateful to hear from Sherman earlier. If you ever get a chance to hear Bob speak, he's amazing. And he talked about life as a tapestry, and that each person who comes into our lives gets woven into that tapestry of who we are, each experience that we have. And so it can feel like when someone dies or when we have a loss, that string just gets yanked out and our tapestry just is in shreds. And so we feel like we're shredded as a human. And I think the work in this space for all of us is to recognize that loss and gain and COVID and whatever reality we are going through is creating who we are, and that we are still a complete entity. And recognizing that as part of that complete entity is also the good stuff, right? And taking that step back and recognizing, yeah, there's a lot of really hard stuff and there's a lot of really good stuff. As a healthcare provider, there's telehealth there, that would never have moved forward without COVID. And so many more people have access to healthcare now than they did before. And even with loss comes new opportunities to move into new relationships. And so not wanting to sugarcoat, it's not about ignoring the pain, it's yes and. The pain is there, and also there's this other stuff. And we can see that as a cohesive whole in our own individual tapestry. So I'm aware that I'm right at the end of my time, and so we'll cede the floor back and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I could go on and on about each of your sessions, but I'm going to keep us moving along. Very powerful. Lisa, I think you are next.
Thank you. Yes, very powerful themes indeed. I echo the words that Erica or Erin just said, which is that not to forget that there's an awful lot of energy embedded in all of these very powerful emotions. So we'll get to that. Who am I? I am a general and forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. And I guess the way to launch this best is to say that I ran for the U.S. Senate back in 2005, 2006 in Maryland. And as you can see, I did not win. But what it did do was it poised me and positioned me to engage in the work that I've been doing for the last 17 years, other than my work as a psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist, and that is the mental health toll of climate disruption. And so I've been doing that for a good deal of time. I had the first conference in 2009 on the topic, and have been writing about it and presenting on it now for a good deal of time. And I think that what I can bring to this group especially is to tease out something that I think is very true. And that is that one of the reasons that I think we have been so disrespectful of nature, and we have ignored the science and shrugged our shoulders at our own personal involvement in what's happening, is exactly what we've been talking about. And that is this avoidance of the reality of life, our grief about loss, about reality. And I find that people often, and I used to be able to shut down a dinner party when I was going to them in just minutes when I would bring up climate issues, because I think that in many respects, our attitudes about the sort of dangers that we are facing really is a metaphor for our own aging, loss, and death. So we have been avoiding this topic, and I think that it is a very a powerful conference today to focus on these things, because we're not going to get change in climate, restoring respect for nature, for each other, and for all of the repercussions on everybody else, until we do recognize and accept that loss is embedded in life. But and it's an and, which is that we can take that energy and turn it into action. And that's what I'd like to talk about just briefly. What gets me up in the morning and what keeps me up at night is the many things that I think are on the table for us that need to happen, because whatever the metaphor is, physics isn't going to wait for us, and we are rapidly reaching tipping points. I completed a chapter for a book that I'm the editor of and principal writer for the American Psychiatric Association Press. And tipping points, temperature tipping points, was one of the things that I just finished writing. And we recognize that the clock is ticking, just as it is in all of the themes that you're talking about, and that we have to act. And if we don't act in time, that we will bring the destructive force of nature taking back control as it has become destabilized by us in ways that are so damaging to others and nature generally, but future generations, our children and future generations particularly. So the advice that I have to give, maybe I will put that at the end. I've already heard a couple of people refer, and Sherman in the last session, talking about authenticity and about humanity. And of course, these are the core features that have to drive the respect that we're looking for life, so that we can embrace all aspects of it. I'll move on to what I'm doing currently, what my current work is, and where I'm taking my interests. And that is in a very specific direction. Working as a psychiatrist, I have found that the people that I'm especially influential with are my peers. And so in the mental health professions, of course, there are psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. If you're in this conference, please work with me, contact me, do work independently, whatever you do. But it is critical for us to recognize now the dangers that are mounting and that require immediate attention, because at a certain point, when we reach temperature tipping points, we will have crossed certain thresholds that mean that our ability to take control of our future will have slipped out of our hands. So what I am looking for, and I have focused on and pushing the American Psychiatric Association and my colleagues to focus on, is to understand climate science 101, energy policy, certainly community organizing. And I know this is going to resonate with a lot of us, because we recognize the breadth of the reach that we have to attain in order to mobilize people for change and to recognize realities. Certainly the cross-cultural expertise and sensitivity, mitigation and adaptation to climate issues are key. Resilience, that's been talked about a lot today. Conflict resolution skills, let's face it, we fight about what the right way to cope is too. There are some people who are more avoidant or insist on one thing and not another. Advocacy and speaking, early interventions, and movement building. I'll move on to something that has come up again earlier today, and that is something which is really, I think, going to be dear to most of our hearts, and that is the humanistic aspect of what we do. And I fear that we are becoming somewhat mechanistic. And the DSM, which many of you may be familiar with, in 2013 abolished one of the most important categories, which was the psychosocial aspects of life. And we're not just a sum of biologic or chemical experiences. We have external experiences that color that tapestry that Erin was talking about. And when we go about our professional work, we have to look at that. We have to consider that. We have to recognize that the people we are, not just the sum of our genes, but rather the real life experiences. And in understanding that, it does humanize all of us who are working in this space. And hopefully it will drive us to take the policies that were just expressed a few minutes ago that will change a culture, that will drive us to become more sensitive to each other. And I'm quoting Gary Cohen here, you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And it does push us to drive a sense of empathy in the people who are thought leaders. And those social determinants of mental health are so important for us. I just cited 3, and climate, of course, is, I told you, at the top of the list for me for a variety of reasons, although I wrote a book last year, Emotional Inflammation, and it mentions 10 issues that are social issues and injustice that we face: race violence, gun violence, human rights violations, etc. They're gender issues, and I see a systemic racism I've misspelled, but you know where my heart is. So, and the last thing is, I just want to briefly address that my focus on kids is increasingly prominent. I have 3 children, and I'm conscious that we all are aware of what children are faced with. Whatever legacy we leave them is what they are going to have to address. I am the expert witness in the psychological damages from climate disruption in the Juliana versus the US government case, Dr. James Hansen and 21 plaintiffs suing the government for inaction. And the newest case, which is Held versus the state of Montana. The state of Montana has specifically in its constitution that there is a responsibility to take care of the environment, which is, of course, life writ large. And the plaintiffs are suing Montana because of its focus on developing fossil fuels, which of course lead to the tipping points when we burn them, that take our control for what happens to us out of our hands. So I hope you understand that all of these things are interrelated. This is a holistic attitude about learning about life and accepting the realities and taking them and turning what we know into what we do to change the forecast to a more humanistic and realistic society. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I know people were commenting in the chat that you're really glad that this topic was also included. So I really appreciate your perspective. Noni, it is your turn.
All right. Are my slides visible?
Yep, and I can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Noni Gaylord-Harden, and I would like to start by expressing my deepest gratitude to the organizers of this event. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. And thank you for the opportunity to share this virtual stage with such esteemed colleagues. So a bit about me. Who am I? Well, by training, I am a child clinical psychologist. By profession, I'm a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Texas A&M University, where I teach and lead the Youth Rising Research Lab in the clinical psychology program. I have multiple identities that I want to acknowledge. I'm a Black cisgender woman. I'm a mother, wife, daughter, sister, friend. I mentioned psychologist and researcher and instructor. I'm also a mentor, a mentee. I consider myself a lifelong learner who loves to read, and I am a runner. And these identities create a unique lens for the work that I do. But I do want to note something about my lived experiences. So my research program, which I'll mention a little bit more in a few minutes, focuses on Black youth and families in disinvested or under-resourced urban communities. But as someone who grew up in a very small rural Southern town, a middle-class family, I do not have the lived experiences that the youth in my research studies have. And I think it's critical for me to note this. I always note this in my work with young people and families, and I want to note that here as well, because it means that I approach my work not as an expert, but as a collaborator with young people and families and communities who are experts on their lived experiences in their everyday life. And so what brings me to grief work? I think it's also important for me to share that I do not consider myself to be someone who does grief work. So I feel like I'm crashing the party a bit on today's panel. I conduct research on exposure to community violence among Black adolescents and families in disinvested urban communities. I've been conducting this research for several years, first during my 18 years working in Chicago, and most recently in the Houston area over the past couple of years. And the goals of my work are to address disparities in community violence exposure and to minimize the negative impact of violence exposure. We try to do this through enhancing existing strengths and assets that are embedded in Black youth and families and communities. But through this work, I have learned about the profound impact of traumatic loss in the lives of Black youth and families. So just in thinking about community violence, some of the acts that fall under this might be things like assault or burglary, the use of weapons. We tend to think of community violence exposure as occurring on this continuum of severity. So you may have things that reflect social disorder, things like hearing gunshots in the community. It moves along the continuum into witnessing violence, where young people might hear or see an event that involves the loss of property, the threat of physical injury, actual injury, or even death, and moves into what we consider to be violent victimization, where these things happen to the individual. And they are the object of these intentional acts that are initiated by another person to cause harm. For well over a decade, homicide has been the leading cause of death for Black men from age 15 until age 30. And I won't go through each one of these, and many of you have seen these figures before. What I want to point out is that not only does homicide, is it related to mortality figures, but there's another statistic that's often used in public health. And this is the statistic is considered to be the years of potential life lost for a population. So it reflects premature death, right? And how much of a person's life is lost through homicide that occurs early in life. And so not only is homicide the leading cause of death, but it's also the leading cause of years of potential life lost for Black boys and men. Now, criminology, public health, even medicine often focus on the physical toll of violence, the mortality, the injury. My work focuses on the emotional and psychological toll of violence. Yes, physical lives are cut short, but emotional lives are also disrupted or cut short. And that's because the young people who lose their lives are survived by young people who often remain nameless. The friends, the classmates, the brothers, the sisters, the cousins, the neighbors, young people who must continue on with their lives, carrying the loss and trauma of these incidents and many others. So those youth tend to be the focus of my research. But what I've learned in my work on community violence exposure is that Black adolescents are disproportionately exposed to traumatic loss. And I think some of this was discussed in the first session, so I won't go into great detail on this, but there's been work with middle school aged young people, and this work has shown that 3 out of 4 African-American youth report the death of a close family member or a friend. Now, these deaths were twice as likely to occur from illness and disease than from violence, but of those that occurred from violence, the impact of that trauma was significant. We also know that older adolescents are more likely to experience traumatic loss. Homicide loss tends to peak in Black boys around ages 15 to 17. And by the time boys reach early adulthood, they have had an average of 3 homicide deaths of friends and family members. One of our studies with high school boys showed that 55% of young people experience the loss of a close family member, 32% experience the loss of a close friend. and the loss of a close friend was often due to violence. The other issue is you have a high prevalence of traumatic loss, but also a lack of awareness of this loss amongst people who work with young people. So not only is it an understudied topic in research with Black youth, as I think was mentioned earlier today, it's also underaddressed in applied work with young people. There's research examining how much therapists know about their young clients' exposure to community violence, and it shows that therapists severely underestimate exposure to community violence, particularly for fatal events. Okay. There was one study that found that a substantial proportion of young clients reported having witnessed a death, but none of their therapists reported that their clients had witnessed such fatal events. The other issue is the impact of traumatic loss on well-being. We know that traumatic loss is a unique form of violence that contributes to mental health difficulties. Youth may experience traumatic grief when losing someone close to them in sudden or unexpected circumstances. We know that the experience of traumatic loss has been associated with increased symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, feelings of hopelessness, and also post-traumatic stress symptoms. There have been studies showing that almost a quarter of young people reporting a loss from any source scored in the severe traumatic grief range. However, the impact of traumatic loss exacerbated this grief reaction. One of our studies with high school boys, African-American boys, found that boys that were bereaved by violent deaths were more preoccupied with the circumstances of the death and less likely to report adaptive grief reactions than youth in the sample who were bereaved by other types of death. And these youth who were exposed to violent death were at an increased risk of also being a victim of violence themselves later or engaging in violent behavior. So kind of what comes up for me when I hear the theme for today's conference, and how does that theme resonate with me? You know, I kind of have these tensions, right? Competing tensions, because on one hand, I'm hopeful that we are increasing the interest in this very timely and important topic. Just the sheer number of people who are sharing this space with us today indicates that this is a topic that is being elevated in discussions among people who work with young people and who work with adults, just by providing a central location for disseminating knowledge about where we are as a field is encouraging. And on the other hand, I'm apprehensive. And I'm apprehensive that the work will move forward without the voices of young people in communities who are disproportionately, or rather systematically, impacted by loss. And I'm apprehensive that the work will move forward without humanizing the experiences of Black youth. And I can speak to this more in the question and answer session, because I know we want to move into that. But I just wanted to note that on one hand, I'm hopeful. On the other hand, I'm a little worried about the young people with whom I work and their voices not being included in future work on this topic. And so I would say thank you to my lab and the university for their support of this work. And I will turn it back over to Christina.
Thank you, Noni. Very, very overwhelmed with all and your 4 people. And I really appreciate, that this work is so personal. And even if it wasn't as personal before you got into the work, you have all really resonated with your topics. You could have chosen any number of things, I think, to pursue. And your journey has been, heartbreaking and fascinating and really helpful, I think, for our discussion. So really appreciate what you've shared. So we have a few questions that I'll just pose to any of you that might want to answer. And I've also been taking notes of things that have popped in my brain as you have spoken. And also just another reminder, if people have a specific question for our speakers, please put that in the Q&A box. So here's one question. What are you learning, finding? What do you want to share that you think is the future of grief sensitivity, counseling, grief work for providers, for the field? You don't all have to answer. I want to give you the space to do so if you don't feel like you were able to share something on that topic. So we'll start with that question.
I'm happy to jump in on this one because I think it's been echoed so many times today, is the lack of representation in any research, but grief research specifically, in so many different layers of intersectionality. Noni just so beautifully highlighted the needs of African-American youth. And I would say, you know, older adults get left out of research on everything, including the medications designed to address older adult issues. And in grief, where, you know, older adults, it's the most prevalent group because, of course, your age cohort is dying. And so just by the nature of regular human life. And so I would say that the layers of intersectionality that we need to be thinking about need to be represented more effectively in future grief research.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Oh, Lisa, I think you're speaking, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, no one's going to miss this dramatically if he or she doesn't hear it. But I really do believe that when we have a system, and I am probably overstating the DSM, but within the culture of caregiving, at least within my profession, the idea that we would officially recognize what kinds of lives people are leading. And if you have lost friends through gun violence, that shows up on an assessment of your life, and that it isn't just shrugged off that you've been to a protest and hit over the head because it happened to be a Black Lives Matter protest, or that you have gender identity issues that have made you feel as if you were scapegoated and indeed were scapegoated, or climate grief because you're fearful of the future. These things need to be brought officially into the fabric of our society. And, you know, it's noteworthy to me, why are there 5 women here? I know it wasn't because you've chosen people systematically like that are based on gender, but I realize that in all my climate work, it's women who end up being at the table talking about these issues. How do we, you know, what is that? And is this genetic? Is this cultural? Is this? So I asked that question to try to better understand how to infuse society with the very themes that we are promoting.
Yeah, it's a reasonable point. I think it comes up in the field in many aspects. Who we end up training, who are possibly on this call today, but I think it is you know, something bigger than we'll capture here, but it is a reasonable point. So I appreciate that. Anyone else want to comment on that question, or we can move on?
Sure, I can.
Oh, go ahead, Erica.
Okay. And actually, I've just really, the question was, what do we sort of feel is important for the future?
Yeah. What's the sort of the future of the work, the field for providers?
Okay, yeah, that's what I was having in mind, but I just realized I just wanted to clarify. I think it's really important. It'll be really important for providers and just, you know, all of us in general to continually acknowledge cumulative grief, and just that we have experienced loss and grief in our lives, you know, from very early on, and our society, you know, doesn't give a lot of space or time or energy or acknowledgement of grief, or to work with it or process it. And that it's just really important for probably every person to recognize that there's a lot of loss that's been unaddressed and that's been disenfranchised, either knowingly or unknowingly, just, you know, because of the nature of our lives and society and work society. So to continually look at that.
I'll just mention, thank you all for sharing. I think some lessons that we have learned in my work on trauma that I wonder, how they could be applied to grief work. We are learning how important the role of context is in determining what are adaptive, using this, and maladaptive trauma responses. And some of our work has shown that behaviors that we consider to be dysfunctional or maladaptive, or even symptoms, particularly hypervigilance and hyperarousal, which fall under PTSD, can be adaptive in certain contexts. We found that over time, they predict less violence exposure in African-American adolescents. And so it causes us to rethink some of our intervention efforts and to ensure that our intervention efforts are not disabling survival strategies for these young people, right? And I wonder if we might see the same for the grief process, if there are certain ways of grieving that are considered to be dysfunctional or maladaptive that may actually be adaptive and helpful in certain contexts or within certain cultures, right? So I think not only the unique role of context, but the unique contribution of culture in the grief process is something that I think is important for the future of grief sensitivity. Also, the field of trauma is beginning to embrace community trauma, or collective trauma, even cultural trauma. These are words that we're hearing more and more now, and there's a recognition that trauma occurs at the individual level, but also at the community level. And in thinking about traumatic loss in communities, some of these impact individual families, but some of them impact the entire community. And so are there ways of thinking about grief on a more communal level, right, rather than just on an individual level?
Thank you so much. There's just keep going for days, I think. That was really helpful. Are there other thoughts you have as to how the grief field, I don't even know how we put that in a box, and but for folks who are working in that arena, how does that field or that part of our field need to expand and grow, and why or how? So anyone feel free to chime in.
It strikes me that as our society has become ever more technologically oriented, that this mechanistic view of life, where unless you're productive, you don't count, your feelings aren't important, the world turns on technologic progress. And so this interest and push that I have for the restorative effects of reconnecting with nature, which is really, that's who designed us. It's research and development over millions of years that created us. That is our natural home. And I think one thing to consider is that as we have drifted from what nature provides for us, the healing effects, and we saw people during COVID heading out to nature, the healing effects of nature, which are profound and broad, are a way for us to recognize that just as in nature, we grow old, we die, we give birth, we do all of these things. And I think that it will bring back to us the sense that we are living in harmony with the way life has been designed, as opposed to this technologic orientation where everything is supposed to work at the touch of a button. And if you're flawed in any way, you're tossed out. And that includes feelings of grief and vulnerability.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else have any? Oh, Erin, thank you, please.
Sure. So I think, in addition to thinking about unique populations, and, even earlier somebody was mentioning there's nothing on grief in Indigenous populations, and there's, nothing on grief in, not enough on grief in various populations. I think in addition to that, and there have been several comments in the chat about need for training in grief. And I would certainly echo that. One of the comments also said, if we train so much on it, is that going to over-pathologize it? And so I think I just want to highlight again that critical distinction between grief in response to a loss, whether it's a loss of function, a loss of a human, a loss of a dog, a loss of whatever it is that we might have lost, it is normal to have a grief reaction. And we don't want to pathologize the idea that we have emotions in response to something that we have lost. That's a normal human experience. And helping people to understand that normal human experience, and also recognizing when people may need support, and whether that is from a trained psychotherapist or whether that is from family or clergy or whomever. I think that recognition is important. And then two, where it crosses over into somebody is actually experiencing the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder, which we know are linked to lots of other physical health issues and other functional problems. And so much like we teach about in geriatrics, we teach about here's what normal aging looks like. So you know it when you see it and you don't over pathologize it. And then here's what isn't normal in aging. So dementia isn't normal, depression isn't normal. And so helping people to understand what that might look like. So where are kind of the variations of what might be normal? And then where might people benefit from a little something extra? And where might people need professional intervention? So that whole spectrum. And if we are effectively educating healthcare providers across, in primary care is where people tend to go first. There's something wrong with me, fix me. So not just mental health providers, but and communities too. As Noni was just so beautifully talking about, grief as a community entity. And so I think those of us who, and folks on this call, talking about grief in communities and removing the taboo around even just having those conversations, I think that we can take the field forward and take our communities forward potentially.
Please.
I think it's sort of adding to that, like really important for us all to kind of always keep in mind that we're learning at different levels. And so, we might understand something in our heads, but also need to learn to sort of bring it down to our hearts, or to feel it in our bodies, and to really like apply the knowledge that we learn. So I think all of us at some point have brought up, or it's been brought up several times in the last panel or this panel of how we all experience loss, or we all have a variety of grief reactions, but really like understanding that and having that, applying like for yourself when you're grieving of kind of accepting or letting those grief reactions be there, or not judging oneself if the way you imagine grief reactions to be, it isn't the way it is. Being able to apply that to oneself, and then to also help guide others if that's your role with grief, to really to more than just understanding like, oh sure, yeah, we all have grief reactions and there's a variety of them, but really of like, oh, we really grieve in a variety of ways, and embracing that on a different level.
I'll add to it. I just need to say I'm really jealous of the participants right now, because just being able to listen to the three of you talk about this, I just wish I was just, in that space listening. Right? I'm happy to be here as a panelist, but wow.
It's wonderful to listen to you too.
Wow. I think in terms of the field expanding, one of my first conversations with Leora, she talked about grief bias and who gets to grieve and why. And I think that's just such an important question. And, a lot of my work on community violence exposure focused on desensitization to violence and whether or not that was a thing. And I started that work because I was concerned with the number of times I heard people who work with young people say that those young people were desensitized to violence, that it wasn't having an impact on them because it happens to them all the time. And, I found that was not the case, that it does have an impact on them. But the way that is expressed is influenced by context and culture. So it doesn't always show up in the way that we expect it to show up. And as I learn more about traumatic loss, I'm concerned about people making the same assumptions about the impact of loss on Black youth who've experienced high levels of traumatic loss. And so I think we have to decenter grief scholarship from whiteness and recenter it to reflect the lived experiences of Black adolescents if you're doing work on that population or whatever population you're doing work on, right? And thinking about if you're doing that work, what are your belief systems, or what is your worldview, and how does that impact how you respond to youth who've experienced traumatic loss? I mentioned this earlier, we have to center the voices of young people in this work. And we also, I think, have to address the role of structural inequities as drivers of disparities and loss. We know that violence and trauma is rooted in social inequities such as systemic racism, poverty, oppression, the erasure of cultures and communities. And we have to keep that at the forefront of our work on grief and loss. And I think lastly, something I'm learning a little bit more about is moving away from kind of trauma-informed to healing. And I think that could also be applicable to the grief work, is how do we move towards, what does healing mean, and how do we move towards that, right? That we're not just kind of getting back at a baseline level of functioning, but we're healing from our experiences.
May I just react for just a moment, if it's okay, to what both Noni and Lise talked about, sort of adapting to the environment that we're in. And Noni, as you were talking, what comes to mind is a 10-year-old kid on the south side of Chicago. We were doing a wellness program on the south side of Chicago in a church and talking about physical activity. And we were talking to kids who were coming in and out, and we were asking physical activity. And this 10-year-old kid said, well, we actually have this sort of like American Ninja Warrior thing set up in our the space between our buildings, because we have to be ready to dodge and dive and weave when the gunshots start. And so we have to, like, my awareness of what's going on in my world is that when I walk down the street, I'm aware of every place that I could dive or dodge or weave. And sometimes I practice doing that just so I can, be ready. And so I get a lot of physical activity. And he said this in such a prideful sort of way that all of us in our upper middle class whiteness, our jaws dropped. And I'm reacting to that because there are a lot of folks who would call that adaptive. And sure, adaptive perhaps, in Lisa's earlier comment, we're adapting to the society we're being given. But is that adaptive? Is it how we want to deal with loss and grief, is to learn how to dodge and bob and weave? And so I'm sorry, I realized that Christina, that gets away from your original question, but I was just so struck by those ideas about how we think about what people are reacting to and what kinds of reactions people have in what kinds of spaces. And what would happen if that kid was given a safe space to be in and a safe space to feel, so that bobbing and weaving and diving into doorways wasn't his existence. Sorry, I realized we got a little away from grief on that one, but I was just so struck by both of your comments in that space. Thank you.
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions, and I don't want to stop this conversation, but I wanted to just give space to a couple of people that did chime in the Q&A section. So would you recommend any books about the grieving process or something related to your work? And maybe if you have something, you can either put it in the chat or you can share it now. But that's super helpful. So that was one question that someone had. Does anyone want to share briefly a title or two or an author or two?
Would I be shamelessly sort of self-aggrandizing by saying that I wrote a book that came out a year and a half ago that was specifically focused on these issues, and that there is a section, most of the book really, that is involved in what we've dubbed the Restore Plan. And I have to say that I'm no different from anybody else. I recognize the grief, the loss, the trauma, the tragedy, maybe not as intimately, certainly, as some of the people that you have talked about, but I've been around the block. And I do highly recommend, if you are interested and if you need if you can get it online, discounted, call me, email me, I'll get a copy to you. But Restore is the program. And it is in harmony with how we were designed and how nature can help us heal. In addition to some of the steps that we can take consciously to address the problems that we've talked about.
Yeah, and I see some folks are putting it in the chat from the audience, and that's fantastic too. But if you had any suggestions for authors or books, just feel free to shout those out, or you can put them in the chat.
I'm just going to say one more thing, that we have a tendency to do data dumps when we want to convince people. But every study shows that it's that emotional connection that leads to change.
Yeah, I think we heard that in the last session as well. Wasn't so much how to do the exact skilled thing. It was more about the sincerity, the genuineness,
Humanity.
connection. Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of a theme I've heard. Well, another, I know we're almost out of time, but another topic that I wanted to at least give you an option to comment on is on the topic of that community level grief work. Has integration of restorative justice practices, been utilized or studied? Leora was kind enough to put in something to reference, but wanted to see if there were resources you might share. I don't know if any of you have experience with those practices or how they've been looked into.
I have some experience, but I'm not, I would have to think more about how it relates to grief work, because it's been specific to a certain area, right, around behavior, around violence. And so I'd have to think a little bit more. I think it's an interesting question. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think part of the future of this work is recognizing the community level impact of these things, of these experiences, and how even a community's response might be different than what a different community might expect, in terms of a response. And I really appreciate Erin's example of that young man and thinking about what's happening for him, right? That's the way of humanizing it, right? Like taking it out of the numbers and thinking about an individual. And to answer your question, yes, it is adaptive. What's happening, what he's doing is adaptive behavior, because it's adapted to that context. That's what we call conditional adaptation. And what that means is some behaviors are adaptive in certain contexts, but not in others. So yes, it's adaptive for where he is, but it might not be adaptive in school, right? Or it might get him in trouble in school, right? Or as he gets a little bit older, as a teenager, first job, it might be in trouble, right? But just thinking about the community level, these are behaviors that are not only encouraged and shared among community members. Parents suggest that young people do these. Teachers suggest that young people engage in these behaviors. So I think, again, we have to reframe what we think is adaptive, not only at the individual level, but also at the community level, because it may not look like what we would do in our own communities. But again, we don't have the same experiences, right, of walking outside and wondering if you're going to get shot.
Noni, there's
I'm wondering who's going to, who next in your life might be lost. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I have to say farewell in just about a minute, but another question in here that is right in that line, curious about the work being done upstream to change the expectation of, that violence, death, grief will be part of Black and BIPOC cultures. So then communities would begin to reject that versus expect to experience it. That's a complex question. I don't expect the answers to come all today. And I imagine that we will hopefully be collecting all these questions and might, reach out to you to get some sort of summary. But any last thoughts on that before we say farewell from any direction, any of you?
Gratitude for all of the work done here today. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you to everyone.
Real honor to have been with you all.
Same, thank you. It's great to serve on this panel with you all.
Well, I certainly, want to give a big thank you to all of you. And I'm sorry we couldn't have more time for all the thoughts and questions that came up, but we've taken note of them, and we will make sure we include some resources or reach back out. Really, really appreciate having met all of you, introducing us to some of these new directions and thoughts and ideas, the personal, the professional. So if you want to put a chat into for everyone, a takeaway or a gratitude that you've experienced during this. We've seen some things coming throughout the session. We want to thank you for your resilience as you make through this day of Zoom, which we know is another grief process. That this is often how we connect, but it is what we have. And so we welcome everyone to take a break and then come back in 10 minutes with the session 3, lived experience, culture, and grief. Again, thank you, Lisa, Erin, Erica, and Noni. Just couldn't have done this without you. Very, very grateful, and grateful to everyone on the call today. So thank you.